She had everything money could buy: the penthouse overlooking Central Park, the private jet, the investment portfolio that made Wall Street executives envious. But Victoria Chen sat alone every night in her marble-floored living room, wondering if success had cost her the one thing wealth couldn't purchase. At 52, she'd built an empire from nothing, climbed every ladder, shattered every glass ceiling, and somehow missed the moment when life became just a series of board meetings and empty victories. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything changed when a 20-year-old barista named Daniel looked up from making her usual cappuccino and asked, with genuine concern in his voice, if she was okay. Not how, "May I help you, ma'am?" or the rehearsed corporate pleasantries she heard all day. Just real, human kindness that cut through years of carefully constructed walls. What happened next defied every rule Victoria had lived by, every carefully calculated business decision, every risk assessment, every logical framework she'd used to build her fortune. She found herself returning to that coffee shop day after day. Not for the coffee, but for those brief moments of authentic connection with someone who saw her not as the CEO, not as the millionaire, but simply as a person who looked tired and needed kindness. This is the story of how a woman who had everything discovered she had nothing that truly mattered, and how a young man with almost no money taught her the value of gentle love. It's about the courage it takes to be vulnerable after years of being invincible, and the unexpected places where we find the connections that change everything. Because sometimes the greatest risk isn't in the boardroom, it's in opening your heart to someone the world says you shouldn't love, and discovering that the most profitable investment you'll ever make is in human connection. Victoria Chen's story began 40 years ago in a cramped apartment in Queens, where she watched her immigrant parents work 3 jobs between them just to keep the lights on. She learned early that money meant security, that success meant never being vulnerable, and that love was a luxury for people who had the time and safety to indulge in it. By 30, she'd founded her first tech company. By 40, she'd sold it for $200 million and started an investment firm that turned struggling startups into industry giants. By 50, she was regularly featured in Forbes and Fortune, invited to speak at conferences around the world, and mentioned in the same breath as the titans of industry she'd once only dreamed of meeting. But success came with sacrifices she'd convinced herself were necessary. A marriage that ended after 5 years because her husband resented being Mr. Victoria Chen. Friendships that faded because she was always traveling, always working, always chasing the next deal. Family gatherings she missed because there was always a more important meeting, a more crucial negotiation. She told herself it was worth it. Every promotion, every million added to her net worth, every article written about her achievements, these were the markers of a life well lived, weren't they? She'd proven everyone wrong, who said a woman couldn't make it in tech, who said immigrants' children should be grateful for any opportunity, who said she was too ambitious, too demanding, too much. Yet in the quiet moments between meetings, in the back of the car service, taking her from one obligation to another, in the private jet flying her to conferences where she'd give inspiring speeches about success, Victoria felt a hollowness she couldn't quite name. She had money to solve every problem except the one that mattered most, the loneliness that no amount of achievement could fill. This is how she found herself on that rainy Tuesday, standing in line at a small coffee shop she'd walked past 1,000 times, but never entered. About to have an encounter that would unravel everything she thought she knew about love, worth, and what it means to truly live. Sometimes life doesn't change in boardrooms or through carefully planned strategies. Sometimes it changes in the most ordinary moments, with the most unexpected people. When we're finally ready to see what's been missing all along. The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday afternoon. The kind of downpour that sends New Yorkers scrambling for cover and turns the streets into rivers. Victoria's usual car service was stuck in traffic 15 blocks away. Her umbrella had turned inside out in the wind, and her $500 silk blouse was plastered to her skin. She ducked into the nearest doorway, which happened to be a small coffee shop called the Daily Grind, the kind of place she'd normally never enter. preferring the efficiency of having her assistant pick up her coffee. But there she was, dripping water onto the worn wooden floors, her designer handbag clutched against her chest, looking like a drowned rat, despite the fortune she was wearing. "Oh wow, you're soaked," a voice said, warm with genuine concern. Victoria looked up to see a young man with kind eyes and an easy smile, hurrying from behind the counter with a towel. "Here, let me help you. I'm Daniel." He handed her the towel without any of the obsequious behavior she was used to from service staff, no recognition of her face from magazine covers. No calculation of how big a tip she might leave. Just simple human kindness from someone who saw another person in need. "Thank you," Victoria said, surprised by how the simple gesture made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had just ... helped her? Without wanting something in return, without an agenda, without seeing her as a means to an end. "Let me make you something warm," Daniel offered. "On the house, you look like you could use it." "Bad day." He had already turned to the espresso machine, moving with the comfortable efficiency of someone who loved his work, who found satisfaction in the simple act of making coffee. "You could say that," Victoria replied, and found herself sitting at the counter instead of taking her drink and leaving. There was something about the cozy warmth of the place, the smell of fresh-baked pastries, the way Daniel hummed quietly to himself as he worked, that made her want to stay. "I'm a firm believer that there's no problem that can't be improved by a good cappuccino," Daniel said, placing a perfect cup in front of her, the foam art creating a delicate heart on the surface. "And for what it's worth, you seem like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Want to talk about it?" Victoria stared at the heart in her coffee and felt something crack open inside her chest. This stranger was offering her something no one in her life had offered in years. No strings attached. No strings attached. Not networking, not pitching, not trying to get something from her. Just human connection. "I'm not sure where I'd even start," she admitted, and Daniel smiled. "How about with your name?" he suggested. And for the first time in decades, Victoria introduced herself without her title, without her company name, without any of the armor she usually wore. "I'm Victoria," she said simply. "And actually, yes, I would love to talk." Victoria told herself she returned to the daily grind the next day because it was convenient, because the coffee was surprisingly good, because it made sense to have a backup option when her car service was delayed. She did not allow herself to acknowledge that she'd thought about Daniel's kind eyes all through her evening meeting, or that she'd smiled when she remembered his terrible joke about coffee being grounds for happiness. But there she was at 3:30 in the afternoon, the same time she'd stumbled in the day before. Daniel looked up when the bell chimed, and his face broke into a genuine smile of recognition. "Hey, Victoria, right, you're back, and hopefully drier than yesterday." "Much drier. Thank you," she said, and felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. Was she nervous? Victoria Chen, who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was nervous about ordering coffee from a 20-something barista, same as yesterday. "The cappuccino that supposedly solved all your problems?" Daniel asked, already reaching for a cup. "Did it work, by the way? Are all your problems solved? Or do you need the extra-strength version today?" Victoria actually laughed, not the polite chuckle she used in business meetings, but a real, spontaneous laugh that surprised her. "I think I might need the extra-strength version for the rest of my life," she admitted. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria's daily visit to the daily grind became the highlight of her day. She started scheduling her meetings around it, finding excuses to be in that neighborhood at 3:30. Each day, she and Daniel talked a little longer about small things at first. The weather, the best pastries, the ridiculous names people gave their custom drinks. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Daniel told her about his dreams of opening his own cafe someday, about the philosophy degree he'd never finished because his family needed financial help, about how he'd learned to find joy in the small rituals of making the perfect cup of coffee. Victoria found herself sharing too carefully at first, then with increasing honesty. She told him about the loneliness of success, about how she'd climbed so high she couldn't remember what it felt like to have solid ground beneath her feet. She didn't tell him exactly who she was. The internet was full of Victoria Chenzen, and he'd never connected her to the CEO, whose face appeared in business magazines. "You know what I think?" Daniel said one afternoon, leaning against the counter as the coffee shop emptied for the late afternoon lull. "I think you've forgotten how to be a person instead of a professional. When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy, not because it was productive or strategic?" Victoria opened her mouth to answer and realized she couldn't remember, not in years, maybe not ever. And in that moment, looking at this young man who seemed to understand her better after 2 weeks than people she'd known for decades, she felt the first stirrings of something she'd long ago decided she didn't have time for. She felt the dangerous, terrifying, exhilarating possibility of falling in love. It happened on a Friday evening when Victoria arrived at the coffee shop to find Daniel locking up early. "Power's out in the whole block," he explained, looking disappointed. "I was hoping you'd come by. I saved you a coffee, made it right before everything went dark." He held up a thermos, and Victoria felt ridiculously touched by the gesture. "I was planning to take it to the park down the street," Daniel continued, suddenly looking uncertain. "Would you, I mean, if you're not busy, would you want to join me? It's a nice evening." Every instinct Victoria had developed over decades in business screamed at her to decline. This crossed a line, moved their relationship from friendly barista and customer to something else entirely. But a stronger voice, one she'd been ignoring for too long, whispered, "When was the last time you sat in a park on a beautiful evening?" "I'd love to," she heard herself say, and Daniel's face lit up in a way that made her chest feel tight. They walked the 3 blocks to the park, Daniel carrying the thermos and Victoria carrying her designer bag. An odd pair that drew no attention in a city used to seeing everything. They sat on a bench overlooking the pond, and Daniel poured coffee into 2 cups he'd brought. The evening sun painted everything gold, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria wasn't thinking about her next meeting, her portfolio performance, or the emails piling up on her phone. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said after a comfortable silence. "Why do you always look so sad when you think no one's watching? I see it sometimes, right before you notice I'm looking, like you're carrying something really heavy." The question should have felt invasive, but somehow it didn't. Maybe because Daniel asked it with such genuine care, or maybe because Victoria was tired of carrying everything alone. "I think I've built a life that looks perfect from the outside," she said slowly, "but feels empty from the inside." "What would make it feel full?" Daniel asked, and Victoria realized no one had ever asked her that before. What did she want? Not what did she need to achieve, not what was the next milestone, but what would actually make her happy. "This," she admitted, the word escaping before she could stop it. "This moment, right here, sitting in a park with someone who sees me as a person, not as a resource. Someone who asks how I'm feeling instead of what I can do for them." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then reached over and gently took her hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt revolutionary. Victoria looked down at their clasped hands, his young and rough from work, hers older and soft from expensive lotions, felt tears prick her eyes. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched with tenderness instead of transaction. And in that moment, she knew she was in trouble. The best, most terrifying kind of trouble. For 3 blissful weeks, Victoria existed in 2 worlds. In one, she was the feared and respected CEO, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. In the other, she was simply Victoria woman who laughed at bad puns, who looked forward to coffee shop conversations, who felt her heart race when a certain barista smiled at her. She knew it couldn't last. The universe has a way of colliding separate worlds. And hers crashed together on a Monday morning when Daniel walked into her office building for a job interview. Unaware that his coffee shop regular was the CEO of the company, Victoria was walking through the lobby when she heard a familiar voice asking the receptionist about directions to the HR department. She turned and locked eyes with Daniel, whose expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something that looked like betrayal. Victoria, he said, looking at her business attire, the tailored suit that cost more than he made in 2 months, the Louboutin heels, the air of authority she wore like armor. You're Victoria Chen? The Victoria Chen? Daniel, she said, acutely aware of the receptionist watching, of the employees streaming through the lobby, of all the reasons this was complicated. I can explain. Please, can we talk in private? In her office, the sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Victoria watched Daniel take in the evidence of exactly who she was. The awards on the walls, the photos with presidents and tech giants. The view that announced power and wealth in every direction. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel asked, and she heard hurt in his voice. All those conversations, all those times you talked about your life being empty, ... You never mentioned that you're one of the richest women in the country. That you're on the cover of magazines. Because when I'm with you, I don't want to be that person, Victoria said, the truth spilling out. For the first time in decades, someone looked at me and didn't see a bank account or a business opportunity or a networking contact. You just saw ... me. Daniel ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as what he did when he was thinking hard. This is crazy. I've been falling for you, and I didn't even know who you really are. The age difference was already... And now there's this massive wealth difference too. Victoria Amabal, you're a billionaire. This is like a bad movie. I know, Victoria said quietly. I know all the reasons this doesn't make sense. I've built a career on logic and reason, and nothing about this is logical or reasonable. But Daniel, for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm actually living instead of just achieving. You make me feel human again. You make me feel ... loved. Not for what I can do or what I have, but just for who I am. Daniel stood at the window of Victoria's office, silent for what felt like an eternity. Below them, the city moved at its frantic pace, everyone rushing somewhere, chasing something, building something. Victoria waited, holding her breath, wondering if she'd just lost the best thing that had happened to her in years because she'd been too afraid to be honest. I need time to think, Daniel finally said, turning to face her. This is a lot. And I'm supposed to have a job interview downstairs in 15 minutes. Which suddenly feels incredibly awkward. Despite everything, he smiled slightly, and Victoria felt a flicker of hope. Cancel it, Victoria said impulsively. Not because of ... this, but because you deserve better than an entry-level marketing position. You deserve to chase your dream of opening your own cafe, not settling for a corporate job you don't want. And how exactly would I afford that? Daniel asked, not unkindly, but with the reality of someone who'd never had the luxury of taking financial risks. Dreams are expensive, Victoria. Some of us have to be practical. Let me invest in you, Victoria offered, then immediately saw his expression close off. Wait, that came out wrong. This isn't about our ... Whatever, this is between us. This is business. I've built my career on spotting potential, and I see it in you. The way you talk about coffee, about creating community spaces, about the cafe you want to build, that's the kind of passion that makes successful businesses. I can't take your money, Daniel said firmly, especially not now. It would taint everything. I need to figure out how I feel about you about all of this without wondering if I'm being bought or if I'm falling for you. Because of what you can give me. Victoria felt the words like a physical blow, but she understood. She'd spent her whole life wondering who wanted her versus who wanted her money, her connections, her influence. Of course, Daniel would need to know the difference. You're right, she said. I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. I need some time, Daniel repeated, moving toward the door. This doesn't mean I care about you, Victoria. These past few weeks have been incredible. But I need to figure out if what I'm feeling is real or if I'm just dazzled by all of ... this. He gestured at the office. The view, the visible markers of her success. Take all the time you need, Victoria said, even though the words hurt to speak. For what it's worth, what I feel for you has nothing to do with being appropriate or logical or making sense on paper. You've given me something no amount of money ever could do, reminded me what it feels like to be truly seen. After Daniel left, Victoria stood alone in her office for the first time, really seeing it for what it was. Beautiful, impressive, and desperately empty. She'd spent decades building this empire, but in the past few weeks, a young barista had shown her that all the success in the world meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. Now she had to wait and see if she'd lost her chance before she'd fully realized what she had. 2 weeks passed with no word from Daniel. Victoria threw herself into work with the kind of intensity that had built her empire, but for the first time, it felt hollow. She closed a major acquisition deal and felt nothing. She gave a keynote speech to thousands and couldn't remember a word she'd said. Success had lost its meaning without someone to share it with. Her assistant noticed the change. "You've walked past the daily grind 3 times this week," Margaret observed carefully, "but you haven't gone in. Are you avoiding someone or hoping to run into them?" Victoria sighed, realizing she'd been transparent despite her best efforts. "Both? Neither. I don't know anymore, Margaret. I've negotiated with the toughest business people in the world, but I have no idea how to navigate this." "Maybe that's the point," Margaret said gently. She'd worked for Victoria for 15 years and had earned the right to speak frankly. You can't negotiate feelings. You can't strategize love. Maybe for once, you just have to be vulnerable and see what happens. That evening, Victoria did something she hadn't done in years. She went to Daniel's neighborhood, to the small apartment building where she'd once dropped him off after they'd walked through the park. She didn't have a plan, which terrified the part of her that always had a plan. She just knew she couldn't let fear make her decisions anymore. She found him sitting on the front steps, a cup of coffee in his hands. Looking up at the stars, you could barely see through the city light pollution. He wasn't surprised to see her, which made her wonder if he'd been hoping she'd come. "Hi," she said simply, sitting down beside him without asking permission. "I know you asked for time, and I'm not here to pressure you. I just, I missed you. And I'm tired of pretending I don't." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then handed her his coffee cup. "It's not as good as the ones I make at work," he admitted. "Turns out the fancy machine makes a difference. But it's honest. Made with what I actually have, not with what I wish I had." Victoria understood the metaphor. "I don't need fancy," she said. "I have fancy. I have everything money can buy. What I need is honest. What I need is real. What I need is someone who makes me laugh at bad puns and reminds me that life is more than quarterly earnings reports." "I've been scared," Daniel admitted. "Scared that I'm not enough. That I can't give you the life you're used to. That people will look at us and think I'm using you, or that you're having some kind of crisis. Scared that the age difference, the money difference, all of it, that it's too much to overcome." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw the same vulnerability she felt. "But I've been miserable without you, and I think maybe being scared together is better than being safe and alone." Victoria reached out and took Daniel's hand, the gesture that had felt so revolutionary that first time in the park, now feeling like coming home. "I've spent my entire adult life calculating risk," she said. "Every business decision, every investment, every move carefully analyzed for potential return. But the best things in my life have never been the calculated ones." "What if it doesn't work?" Daniel asked, voicing the fear they both felt. "What if people are right to be skeptical? What if 6 months from now we realize we're too different, that we want different things, that this was just a beautiful moment that wasn't meant to last?" "Then we'll have had 6 beautiful months," Victoria said firmly. "Daniel, I've spent decades building something that's supposed to last forever, company, a legacy, a fortune, but I've never felt as alive as I do drinking coffee with you. I've never laughed as much as I do when you're making your terrible puns. I've never felt as seen as I do when you look at me." She stood up, pulling him to his feet, feeling bold and terrified and free all at once. I can't promise it will be easy. People will talk, they'll judge, they'll have opinions about our age difference, our wealth difference, all of it. My board might think I've lost my mind. Your friends might think you've sold out. But here's what I can promise, Victoria continued, her voice steady with certainty. I promise to choose you every day, not because it makes sense on paper, but because you make my heart sing. I promise to support your dreams without overshadowing them with my resources. I promise to listen when you tell me I'm working too hard or missing the point. I promise to be vulnerable with you, even when every instinct I have says to put up walls. Daniel pulled her close, and Victoria felt his heart beating against hers. I promise to remind you what matters when you get lost in spreadsheets and strategy, he said softly. I promise to make you laugh, even when you don't think you have time for it. I promise to see you not the CEO, not the millionaire, but you, Victoria. The woman who likes her coffee with exactly 1 sugar, who has a terrible sense of direction, who has the most beautiful laugh I've ever heard. They stood there, on the steps of his modest apartment building, 2 people from completely different worlds choosing to build a bridge between them. It wasn't logical. It wasn't what anyone would advise. It was risky and complicated and beautiful. So what now? Daniel asked, smiling against her hair. Victoria thought about her penthouse, her empire, her carefully controlled life. Then she thought about the past few weeks, the joy, the laughter, the feeling of being truly alive. Now, she said, pulling back to look at him. Now we get coffee. Now we take walks in the park. Now we figure it out as we go. Now we choose love over logic, connection over calculation, and happiness over what makes sense. Best business decision you ever made, Daniel teased, and Victoria laughed that real, uninhibited laugh he'd coaxed out of her. The only decision I've ever made with my heart, instead of my head, she admitted. And somehow, it feels like the rightest thing I've ever done. 6 months later, Victoria sat in a different coffee shop, the Daily Grind's second location. Daniel's dream finally realized. Not through her money, he'd refused until he'd saved enough himself, and she'd agreed to be a minority investor only, with proper legal contracts, but through his hard work, passion, and vision. She watched him work, creating not just coffee, but community, exactly as he'd imagined. And she understood that the greatest gift they'd given each other wasn't financial or practical, it was permission to be fully human. Their relationship still raised eyebrows. Victoria's board had initially been concerned, though her continued success silenced most critics. Daniel's friends had been skeptical until they saw how genuinely happy he was. The media had had their field day with May-December romance of tech titan, but Victoria had learned to care less about headlines and more about the moments that mattered Sunday mornings in bed. Conversations over dinner, the quiet joy of being known and loved for who you are, not what you've accomplished. She'd learned that gentle love wasn't weak, it was the strongest force she'd ever encountered. Strong enough to soften the hardest edges of her carefully controlled life. She'd spent decades believing that vulnerability was weakness, that opening her heart was a liability, that love was something for people who had the luxury of not focusing on success. But Daniel had taught her that the opposite was truth, that closing yourself off was the real weakness, that protecting your heart meant never truly living, and that success without love was just another form of poverty. She'd been a millionaire who had nothing that mattered until a young man with gentle eyes and a kind heart showed her what true wealth really meant. And that was worth more than everything in her portfolio combined.